The world had shrunk to the rough, splintered grain of a wagon wheel and the suffocating heat of a merciless sun. My wrists were raw, the rope a serpent of fire, coiling around my skin with every shift of my weight. Thirst was a living thing in my throat, a rasping creature made of dust and despair. Around me, the sounds of the Founders' Day festival, the laughter, the tinny music, the calls of vendors, were a distant, mocking chorus. Here, in the center of the town square, I was the day's chief entertainment, the final, pathetic prize in a mock bride auction meant to raise funds for a new town well. A joke. My stepmother Agnes's finest, most public humiliation of me yet. "A fine, sturdy girl," the auctioneer, Mayor Thompson, bellowed, his face ruddy with sweat and cheap whiskey. "Quiet, hardworking, won't give a man a lick of trouble. Who'll start the bidding for the hand of Miss Elara Vance, all for the good of the town?" A smattering of cruel laughter rippled through the crowd. I kept my eyes fixed on a crack in the dusty ground before me, a tiny fissure in the baked earth that felt like a map of my own shattered soul. I could feel their gazes upon me, a physical weight of pity and contempt. They saw what Agnes had spent years teaching them to see, a plain, sallow creature, a shadow eclipsed by the sun of her beautiful, vibrant stepsister, Rosalind. I was the drab moth to her painted butterfly. Even now, I could picture Rosalind on the dais with my father and Agnes, her expression a careful mixture of discomfort and detachment. She would not enjoy my suffering, not actively, but she would do nothing to stop it. And my father, he would simply stare at his polished boots, wishing for a quiet life, a wish for which he had long ago sacrificed my happiness. $5, someone shouted from the back, a drunken ranch hand looking for a laugh. The crowd roared. $5 for a wife, the mayor crowed. A bargain at twice the price. My shame was a physical cloak, heavy and suffocating. It was not the ropes or the sun that held me captive, but this feeling of utter worthlessness so carefully cultivated over a decade by a woman who despised my very existence. I was a weed in her perfectly manicured garden, a constant, irritating reminder of my mother, the woman my father had loved before her. Agnes had made it her life's work to root me out, to crush me until I was nothing but dust under her heel. Today, it seemed, she was finally succeeding. I closed my eyes, wishing the world would simply dissolve into the shimmering heat haze. Then, a change. A subtle shift in the atmosphere, a silencing of the noise that was more profound than any sound. The laughter died in throats. The mayor's booming voice faltered, trailing off into a confused mumble. A wave of stillness spread from the edge of the square, a palpable quiet that made the hairs on my arms stand on end. I dared to lift my gaze from the cracked earth. He had arrived. He sat astride a horse the color of midnight, a creature of such size and power it seemed to drink the very light from the air. The man himself was no less imposing. Silas Blackwood. The name was a whispered legend in our valley, a story told to frighten children and chasten boastful men. He was the owner of the Shadow Creek Ranch, a vast, untamed kingdom of rock and river that bordered the town. He was a recluse, a man of immense wealth and sorrow, who had not been seen in the town proper for 5 years, not since the death of his wife. He was severe, silent, and said to be as hard as the granite cliffs on his land. His face was unreadable, carved from stone, with eyes that missed nothing. He was not looking at the mayor or the stunned crowd. He was looking at me. His gaze was not hot with pity or cold with contempt. It was something else entirely, a focused, unnerving intensity, like a hawk studying its prey. But I did not feel like prey. For the first time in my life, under that piercing stare, I felt seen. He dismounted with a fluid grace that belied his size. The dust barely stirred as his boots met the ground. Every eye in the square followed him as he walked forward, his steps measured and deliberate. The crowd parted before him like the Red Sea, a path clearing from the edge of the square directly to the wagon wheel where I was bound. He stopped before me, so close I could see the fine lines etched around his eyes, the faint scar that cut through one dark eyebrow. Mayor Thompson finally found his voice, a nervous, reedy thing. "Mr. Blackwood, we are honored by your presence. Just a bit of civic fundraising, you understand." Silas Blackwood did not spare him a glance. His attention remained solely on me. "How much for the well?" he asked, his voice low and rough, like stones grinding together. It was a sound that carried, cutting through the silence with absolute authority. The mayor blinked. "Well, our goal's $500, sir." "Done," Silas said. He reached into the pocket of his coat and produced a leather pouch, tossing it to the stunned mayor, who fumbled to catch it. "There is 1,000 for the well and for the inconvenience." He then turned his gaze to my stepmother, who stood frozen on the dais, her painted smile looking brittle and foolish. For the first time, I saw a flicker of fear in her eyes. He drew a long, sharp knife from a sheath on his belt. A collective gasp went through the crowd. He stepped forward, and in one swift, clean motion, he sliced through the ropes binding my wrists. The fibers parted like a sigh of relief. The sudden freedom was so shocking that I nearly collapsed, my legs trembling violently. Before I could fall, his hands were on my arms, steadying me. His touch was firm, surprisingly gentle, and sent a jolt through my exhausted body. He looked down at my raw wrists, his expression tightening into something grim. He shrugged off his own dark coat and draped it over my shoulders. It was heavy, smelling of leather and sagebrush and cold, clean air. It swallowed me whole, a shield against the prying eyes of the world. "She's no longer part of this transaction," he stated, his voice leaving no room for argument. He then did something that shattered the last vestiges of reality for every person in that square. He bent and slid one arm beneath my knees and the other around my back, lifting me effortlessly into his arms. I was too stunned to protest, my head falling against the solid wall of his chest. He turned and carried me back toward his horse, the crowd parting before him in a wave of silent awe and confusion. I could feel the frantic, disbelieving beat of my own heart, the thunderous, steady rhythm of his. As he swung me up into the saddle before him, I risked a glance back. I saw my father's face, pale and slack-jawed. I saw Rosalind, her hand over her mouth, her eyes wide with something that might have been wonder. And I saw Agnes, her face a mask of pure, venomous fury. Her plan, her grand humiliation, had not just failed, it had been spectacularly destroyed. Silas Blackwood mounted behind me, his arms a secure cage around my body. He said nothing, simply gathered the reins. With a soft click of his tongue, the great black horse turned and began to walk, then trot, then canter away from the town square, leaving behind a tableau of stunned silence and the smoldering ruins of my old life. I was being carried away by a myth, a ghost, a man of shadow and stone, and I had no idea if I was being rescued or merely claimed by a new, more powerful captor. As the dust of the town faded behind us, I closed my eyes, the scent of sage filling my lungs, and for the first time in years, I felt a terrifying, unfamiliar flicker of something that might have been hope. The ride to Shadow Creek Ranch was a blur of motion and sensation, the rhythmic gait of the horse, the solid presence of Silas Blackwood at my back, the vast, empty landscape unfolding around us. We rode in silence, a silence that felt heavier and more profound than any words. I was acutely aware of the warmth of his body shielding me from the wind, the steady beat of his heart against my back. My own thoughts were a maelstrom of fear and confusion. What did he want with me? The town's gossip painted him as a broken man, half mad with grief, who had locked himself away from the world. Was this an act of madness or pity? Pity felt like the cruelest possibility of all, just another form of humiliation. The ranch itself was not what I expected. It was not a place of dark, brooding neglect. The long, low-slung ranch house was built of dark timber and river stone, solid and unpretentious, nestled in a valley carved by a rushing creek. The fences were mended, the barns were in good repair, and the horses in the corral were sleek and well cared for. It was a place of order, of quiet competence, a reflection, I suspected, of the man himself. He dismounted and lifted me down as easily as he had lifted me up. My legs still felt unsteady, and I swayed for a moment, my hand instinctively going to his arm to steady myself. The muscle beneath his sleeve was like iron. He led me to the house, the wide porch echoing with our footsteps. The front door opened before we reached it, and a woman stood there, her hair pulled back in a severe gray bun. She was tall and stern-looking, her apron starched and immaculate. "Martha," Silas said, his voice softer now that we were here. "This is Miss Vance. She will be staying with us. Please prepare the east guest room and draw her a bath. See that she has something to eat." The woman, Martha, looked from her master to me, her eyes taking in my disheveled state, the heavy coat draped over my thin dress, the raw marks on my wrists. Her expression did not change, but I saw a flicker of something in her gaze. Not pity, but a kind of sharp, assessing intelligence. She nodded once, a curt, efficient gesture. "Of course, Mr. Blackwood. This way, miss." I hesitated, looking up at the man who had torn me from my life. His face was still a mask, impossible to read. "Why?" I whispered, the single word all I could manage. He looked down at me, and for a moment I thought he wouldn't answer. "Because no one deserves to be treated like an animal at market," he said simply. "Go with Martha. Rest." He then turned and walked away toward the barns, leaving me on the porch with his formidable housekeeper. The guest room was simple but comfortable, with a large window that looked out over the creek. The bath Martha drew for me was blissfully hot, and as I soaked, I watched the grime and dust of my humiliation sluice away, though the deeper stains on my spirit remained. Martha had laid out a simple, clean dress of soft gray wool and a thick robe. When I was dressed, I found a tray on a small table by the window, a bowl of hearty beef stew, a thick slice of bread, and a glass of cool water. I ate like a starving wolf, the food tasting of a kindness I had not known in years. For 2 days, I was left mostly to myself. I explored the quiet house with its polished wood floors and sparse functional furniture. There were no frills, no decorations, save for the towering shelves of books that lined the walls of one enormous room, his library. I saw Silas only at a distance, a solitary figure riding out at dawn and returning at dusk. I began to suspect he was simply a decent man who had acted on a rare impulse and now had no idea what to do with me. The thought was both a relief and a disappointment. Was I to be just a forgotten guest in his silent house? On the third evening, as I stood before the shelves in his library, running a finger over the leather-bound spines, he entered the room. He moved so quietly I didn't notice him until he spoke. "Do you read?" he asked. I jumped, turning to face him. He stood by the massive stone fireplace, a glass of amber liquid in his hand. "Yes," I said, my voice small. "When I can." Books had been my only escape, my secret solace. Agnes saw them as a waste of time, a pretense to avoid useful work. He nodded toward the shelves. "Help yourself. Most of them belong to my father." He took a sip from his glass, his eyes studying me over the rim. "Martha tells me you barely speak a word." I felt a flush of shame. I have little to say." It was the truth. Years of being told my opinions were worthless had rendered me almost mute. "I doubt that," he said, his voice flat. He walked over to a shelf filled not with literature, but with thick, academic-looking volumes. He pulled one out. "Tell me about Veratrum virid." I stared at him, bewildered. American false hellebore, a common plant in the high meadows and a dangerously toxic one. "It's a poison," I said, confused by the question. "If ingested, it can slow the heart until it stops." "And?" he prompted, his gaze unwavering. A memory stirred, something I hadn't thought of in years. "In very small, carefully prepared doses," I said, the words coming more easily now, speaking of something I knew, something that mattered to me. "A root tincture can be used to treat a racing heart, to calm a fever. My mother was an herbalist. She taught me." A flicker of something, not a smile, but a lessening of the severity in his expression, touched his mouth. 5 years ago, the widow Albright's boy fell ill with a fever. The doctor was a day's ride away and couldn't be reached. The boy was convulsing, his heart hammering in his chest like a trapped bird. No one knew what to do. He paused, his eyes fixed on my face. But a young woman, no older than 15, was there. She had been gathering herbs by the creek. She ran to the meadow, dug a root, and came back. She prepared a tincture, a single drop on the boy's tongue every hour. By morning, his fever had broken. He lived. My breath caught in my throat. I remembered that day. The panic, the boy's terrified mother, the feeling of my own mother's knowledge flowing through my hands, guiding me. I had slipped away afterward before anyone could question me, terrified Agnes would find out and punish me for making a spectacle of myself. "You were there," I whispered, a statement, not a question. "I was riding the ridge above the town," he confirmed. "I saw it all." He placed the book back on the shelf. "When I saw you tied to that wheel, I didn't see a plain, quiet girl. I saw the young woman who knew what no one else did, the one who acted when everyone else stood frozen. I did not buy a prize, Miss Vance. I intervened on behalf of a person of substance." The world tilted on its axis. He had seen me. Not as a burden, not as a shadow, but as a person of worth. He had remembered for 5 years a single act of competence, an act I myself had nearly forgotten, buried under layers of shame and self-doubt. The foundation of my worthlessness, so carefully constructed by Agnes, began to crumble. Tears pricked my eyes, hot and sudden. I turned away, mortified to let him see me cry. I felt a presence beside me. He didn't touch me, but he stood close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from him. "There is no shame in it," he said, his voice unexpectedly gentle. He gestured to a small, worn book on a nearby table. It was a field guide to local flora, its pages dog-eared and its cover soft with use. "A gift, so you can continue your studies if you wish." I picked it up, my fingers trembling. It was more precious than any jewel. He had not offered me charity. He had offered me respect. He had seen a part of me I thought was invisible, and he had valued it. In the quiet of his library, surrounded by the ghosts of 1,000 stories, a new one was beginning to write itself, and for the first time, I felt I might have a voice in it. In the days that followed, a quiet routine began to form. I spent my mornings in the library, devouring the books on botany and herbalism, my mind awakening from a long, starved slumber. In the afternoons, armed with the field guide he had given me, I would walk along the creek that gave the ranch its name, identifying plants, making notes, feeling the texture of leaves and the scent of blossoms. It was a reclamation of a part of myself I had been forced to bury. Silas left me to my own devices, yet I was always aware of his presence. I would see him on a distant ridge, a solitary horseman watching over his domain. Sometimes our paths would cross near the barns. He would nod a greeting, his eyes lingering on the book in my hand or the bundle of herbs I carried, a silent acknowledgement of my purpose. He never crowded me, never demanded anything of me. He simply gave me space, a commodity more valuable than gold. One afternoon, I wandered farther than usual, drawn by a stand of silver-leafed aspens. Beyond them, tucked into a sheltered fold of the hills, I found a greenhouse, or what was left of one. Its glass panes were shattered and cloudy with grime, the frame sagging and overgrown with ivy. The door hung crookedly on one hinge. It was a place of profound neglect, a skeleton of what must have once been a beautiful light-filled space. Curiosity pulled me inside. The air was thick with the smell of decay and damp earth. Rotted wooden benches were overturned, clay pots lay smashed on the floor, and weeds choked everything. Yet, amidst the ruin, a single rose bush had survived. It had grown wild and thorny, climbing one wall toward a jagged hole in the roof, and on its highest branch was a single, perfect, blood-red rose. A survivor, a symbol of stubborn, defiant life. It was hers. I spun around, my heart leaping into my throat. Silas stood in the doorway, his large frame silhouetted against the afternoon sun. His face was cast in shadow, but his voice was filled with a raw, hollow quality I had never heard before. "My wife's," he clarified, stepping inside. He walked over to the defiant rosebush, his gloved hand hovering near the bloom without touching it. "Eleonora. She loved this place. She could make anything grow. She said it was her sanctuary." This was the first time he had ever mentioned her. The town's whispers had told me she died, but nothing more. Now, standing in the ruin of her sanctuary, I felt the shape of his grief, a vast and silent thing that filled the space between us. "She died 5 years ago," he said, his back still to me. "In childbirth. The baby, a son. He did not survive either." His voice was flat, a recitation of facts that had been worn smooth by time but had lost none of their sharp edges. After she was gone, I couldn't bear to look at this place. I locked the door and let it fall to ruin, just as I let everything else fall to ruin. He finally turned to face me. The mask was gone. In its place was a vulnerability so profound, it was like looking into a deep, dark well. I saw the man behind the myth, a man shattered by loss who had walled himself off from the world to keep from breaking completely. My own small miseries seemed insignificant in the face of such monumental pain. "I'm sorry," I whispered, the words wholly inadequate. He gave a short, sharp nod as if to dismiss my sympathy, but his eyes held mine. "You bring things back to life, Elara." He used my given name for the first time, and it sounded strange and new on his tongue. "I've seen you with your plants. You have a gift." An idea, bold and terrifying, took root in my mind. "I could fix it," I heard myself say. "The greenhouse. I could clean it, mend the benches, replant it, if you would let me." He stared at me, his expression unreadable again. I thought he would refuse, that I had overstepped, trespassed on a sacred sorrow. My face burned with embarrassment, and I looked down at the floor. "It was a foolish thought. Forgive me." "No," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "It is not a foolish thought." He looked around the dilapidated structure, his gaze lingering on the single red rose. "It is the first thought that has made any sense in 5 years." He met my eyes again. "You may have any supplies you need from the stores. The space is yours." And so began our project. It became the center of my days. I started by clearing the debris, sweeping away the shattered glass and rotted wood. Silas had 2 of his ranch hands replace the broken panes, their quiet respect a testament to their master's orders. He himself did not help with the labor, but he would often appear at the end of the day, standing in the doorway, watching me work. We began to talk. Not about our pasts, not about our pain, but about the work, about the proper soil mixture for seedlings, the best way to mend a cracked bench, the merits of bone meal versus fish emulsion. Our conversations were practical, grounded in the earth, but beneath the surface, something else was growing. A fragile trust, a quiet companionship. One afternoon, I was on a small ladder, trying to secure a climbing vine to a high trellis. My fingers were clumsy, and the twine kept slipping. "You're pulling it too tight," his voice came from below me. "You'll bruise the stem." He stepped up behind me, his presence solid and warm. "Here," he said. He reached up, his large, calloused hands covering mine, guiding my fingers. His touch was electric. He showed me how to make a loose, gentle knot that would support the vine without strangling it. For a long moment, our hands remained entwined around the vine and the twine, his thumb brushing against my pulse point. I could feel the heat of his body, smell the clean scent of soap and leather. The world narrowed to that single point of contact. My breath hitched. He seemed to realize it at the same time I did. He slowly withdrew his hands, his gaze meeting mine. His eyes, usually so guarded, were dark and intense. The air in the greenhouse grew thick, charged with an unspoken emotion. The severe lines of his face seemed to soften, and for a fleeting instant, I saw a ghost of a smile, a slight upward tilt at the corner of his mouth that transformed his entire countenance. It was a revelation. He cleared his throat and took a step back, breaking the spell. "The light is fading," he said, his voice a little rougher than usual. "You should stop for the day." He turned and left without another word. I remained on the ladder for a long time, my fingers trembling, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. In the ruins of his wife's greenhouse, surrounded by the scent of damp earth and new life, something had irrevocably shifted between us. It was no longer about gratitude or respect. It was something deeper, more dangerous, and far more beautiful, and it terrified me more than any public humiliation ever had. The news of my residence at Shadow Creek Ranch had, of course, spread through the town like wildfire. The story had been twisted and embellished until it bore little resemblance to the truth. Some said I was his prisoner, others that I was his mistress. The one thing everyone agreed on was that my stepmother, Agnes, was incandescent with rage. She had lost face, and far more importantly, She had lost control over me. I knew it was only a matter of time before she struck back. The first blow came in the form of a letter delivered by a grim-faced rider from the town. Silas took it from the man and read it standing on the porch, his back to me. I watched the line of his shoulders grow rigid, his posture hardening into granite. When he turned, his face was a thundercloud, his eyes cold with a fury that was all the more frightening for its silence. "It's from your stepmother," he said, his voice clipped. He held the letter out to me. My hand trembled as I took it. The script was Agnes's elegant, cruel hand, every loop and swirl a testament to her self-satisfaction. The words were poison. She wrote of her deep concern for my welfare, painting me as a fragile, simple-minded creature prone to flights of fancy and delusion. She hinted at fits of hysteria, of a deep-seated instability I had inherited from my mother's side. She claimed I had a history of theft, of taking small, sentimental items and hiding them away like a magpie. She concluded with a cloying plea for him to return me to her care, lest I embarrass him or, worse, bring harm to myself in my confused state. It was a masterful piece of character assassination, designed to plant a seed of doubt, to make him see me as a burden, a mentally deficient stray he had mistakenly taken in. Every word was a slap. The familiar shame washed over me, cold and sickening. This was her true weapon, not ropes or public scorn, but the careful, insidious dismantling of my character until nothing of value was left. I looked up at Silas, expecting to see a flicker of doubt, of suspicion. I was braced for the question, the accusation, but it never came. He simply took the letter from my numb fingers, crumpled it into a tight ball, and tossed it into the fireplace. "Lies," he said, the word a flat, hard stone of certainty. "She thinks I am a fool." He looked at me, his gaze intense. "She thinks you are weak. They are both mistaken." The sheer force of his belief in me was a shield. It did not erase the sting of Agnes's words, but it stopped the poison from sinking in. He didn't question me. He didn't need to. He had judged my character for himself, and he would not be swayed. The relief was so profound, it left me breathless. But Agnes was not a woman to be so easily thwarted. Her second attack was more direct, more brutal. A week later, the town sheriff, a portly man named Blevins, who was firmly in my stepmother's pocket, rode up to the ranch. He was accompanied by another man, a hulking, red-faced landowner from the next county named Jedediah Croft. Croft was known for his crude manners and his cruelty to his livestock. He looked at me with a possessive, leering gaze that made my skin crawl. "Mr. Blackwood," Sheriff Blevins said, puffing out his chest, "I'm here on an official matter. We've come for Miss Vance." Silas moved to stand in front of me, a silent, imposing barrier. "On what grounds?" Blevins produced a document with a flourish. "On the grounds of this here marriage contract, signed and witnessed. Miss Vance is betrothed to Mr. Croft. Her father and guardian, Mr. Albert Vance, has given his consent. The wedding is to be in 2 days." Ice flooded my veins. A forced marriage. To this brute, it was a masterstroke of cruelty. It would remove me from Silas's protection, bind me to a man who would surely break my spirit, and restore me to Agnes's control, albeit indirectly. My father had signed it. He had signed me away like a piece of property to appease his wife and purchase his own peace. The betrayal was absolute, a final crushing blow. I felt the world begin to swim, the edges of my vision going dark. I would be dragged back, bound again, this time for life. "Miss Vance is a guest on my property," Silas said, his voice dangerously low. "She is under my protection. She will not be going anywhere." Croft snorted. "She ain't your property, Blackwood. She's mine. I got the paper to prove it." He took a step forward, his eyes fixed on me. "Come on, girl. Don't make this difficult." Before the man could take another step, Silas moved. It was not a sudden lunge, but a deliberate, chillingly calm motion. He simply took one step to the side and drew the large revolver he wore on his hip. He did not point it at Croft, but held it loosely at his side, the gesture one of quiet, lethal promise. "You have set foot on my land uninvited," Silas said, his voice as cold as a winter river. "You have made a threat against a person in my care. I am giving you and the sheriff exactly 10 seconds to turn your horses around and ride away. If you are still on my property when I finish counting, I will consider it an act of trespass. I am a patient man, but I do not tolerate pests." Sheriff Blevins's face went pale. He knew Silas Blackwood's reputation. He knew the man was not given to idle threats. Jedediah Croft looked from Silas's cold eyes to the dark metal of the gun and seemed to shrink in size. "This ain't over, Blackwood," Croft blustered, but there was no conviction in his voice. He backed away, pulling a nervous Sheriff Blevins with him. They mounted their horses and galloped away, leaving a cloud of dust and impotent fury in their wake. The immediate danger was gone, but the larger threat remained. The contract was legal. My father had signed it. Agnes had me in a cage of law and custom, and it was closing in. I began to tremble, a deep, uncontrollable shaking that came from the very core of my being. Silas holstered his weapon and turned to me. He placed his hands on my shoulders, his grip firm and steadying. "Elara, look at me." I forced myself to meet his gaze. His eyes were dark with a controlled rage, but when they looked at me, they were filled with a fierce protective light. "This is not over," he said, his voice a low growl. "But they will not win. She has gone too far. Now we will finish it." He was not just offering comfort, he was making a promise of a reckoning. Silas was a man of strategy. He did not act with loud, impotent rage, but with the cold, precise application of power. He sent a rider to the territorial capital with a message for his lawyer and another to a man he knew in the land registry office. He spent the next day and a half in his library, poring over maps and ledgers, the door closed, a silent storm gathering within the walls of his quiet house. I was a wreck of nerves, pacing the floor of the greenhouse, unable to focus, the threat of Jedediah Croft hanging over me like a headsman's axe. On the morning of the day I was supposed to be married, Silas found me there. He looked calm, his face set in grim, determined lines. "It is time," he said. "I have sent for them. They will be here within the hour." "Them?" I asked, my heart pounding. "Your stepmother, your father, and your sister," he said, "and Mr. Croft. We will settle this here, in my house, on my terms." The library, once my sanctuary, felt like a courtroom. Silas had me sit in a high-backed chair near the fireplace while he stood before the mantel, a commanding, implacable figure. When the guests arrived, ushered in by a stony-faced Martha, the tension in the room became thick enough to cut. Agnes swept in, her face a mask of triumphant concern. Jedediah Croft followed, looking smug and brutish. My father shuffled in behind them, his gaze fixed on the floor, the picture of a man hollowed out by his own weakness. And then came Rosalind. She looked pale and distressed, her eyes darting from me to Silas, a deep uncertainty clouding her beautiful features. "Mr. Blackwood," Agnes began, her voice dripping with false sweetness, "I am so glad you have seen reason. This is all for Elara's own good. She needs a firm hand, a good husband to look after her." Silas let the silence stretch for a moment before he spoke, his voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the room. "I have not asked you here to discuss this fraudulent contract, madam. I have asked you here to discuss the matter of theft." Agnes's smile faltered. "Theft? I don't know what you mean. Unless you are referring to poor Elara's unfortunate kleptomania." "I am referring," Silas cut in smoothly, "to the dowry of Elara's mother, Cecilia Vance, a sum of $10,000 in gold coin, and the deed to the quarter section of land known as Miller's Meadow, which was to be held in trust for her daughter upon her marriage or her 21st birthday. A trust which you, as her stepmother, and you, Mr. Vance, as her father, were assigned to administer." My father flinched as if struck. Agnes went rigid, the color draining from her face. I stared at Silas, uncomprehending. I had never known about a dowry. Agnes had always told me my mother came from poor stock and brought nothing to the marriage. "This is a preposterous accusation," Agnes hissed, her voice losing its silken edge. Is it?" Silas moved to his desk and picked up a sheaf of papers. "My lawyer in the capital was most efficient. He located the original trust documents. He also located records of consistent, systematic withdrawals made by you, Agnes, over the past 10 years. Funds used to purchase fine dresses, to host lavish parties, to pay for Rosalind's finishing school." He looked at my sister, not with accusation, but with a cool neutrality. And finally, a land registry search revealed that Miller's Meadow was sold 2 years ago to a consortium of which Mr. Jedediah Croft is a primary partner, a sale for which the funds seem to have vanished entirely. He let the papers drop onto the desk. The sound was like a gunshot in the silent room. Croft's smug expression had dissolved into a panicked sweat. My father had sunk into a chair, his face in his hands. Agnes's composure finally shattered. Lies, all of it. She has poisoned you against me, the little snake. The only poison here, madam, is your greed, Silas said, his voice like ice. You have stolen this young woman's inheritance. You have subjected her to years of abuse and neglect. And when you saw she might find a life of her own, a life beyond your control, you attempted to sell her off to your business partner to cover your tracks and silence her forever. This marriage contract is not a social arrangement. It is an instrument of conspiracy and fraud. Everything he said fell into place. A decade of casual cruelties and unexplained hardships suddenly illuminated in a harsh, unforgiving light. The threadbare dresses, the missed meals, the constant reminders of what a burden I was. It had all been a lie, a performance designed to keep me ignorant and powerless while she plundered what was rightfully mine. Agnes turned on me, her face twisted into a snarl of pure hatred. You ungrateful little wretch, after everything I did for you, taking you in, raising you as my own. And then, something inside me broke, not in weakness, but in strength. A dam of silence that had held for a lifetime finally burst. I stood up from my chair, my body trembling not with fear, but with a white-hot, cleansing rage. You did nothing for me, I said, and my own voice sounded strange to my ears, clear and strong, and utterly devoid of fear. You did things to me. You did not raise me. You pruned me. You cut away every new shoot of confidence, every leaf of happiness, hoping I would wither and die in the shade of your own magnificent ego. I took a step toward her, and for the first time in my life, she took a step back. You told me I was plain, so I would never look in a mirror and see my mother's face. You told me I was foolish, so I would never trust my own mind. You told me I was worthless, so I would never ask for what was mine. You tried to make me invisible, Agnes, but you only succeeded in making yourself small. I turned my gaze to my father, who was now weeping softly. And you, I said, my voice softening with a sorrow that was deeper than anger. You let her do it. You bought your peace with my pain. I hope you find it was worth the price. Finally, I looked at Rosalind. She was staring at me, her eyes wide with horrified understanding, as if seeing the landscape of our family clearly for the first time. Tears were streaming down her face. I didn't know, she whispered, her voice choked. Elara, I swear, I never knew. She crossed the room and stood beside me, facing our stepmother. It was a choice, a final, definitive alignment. It's over, Mother. The fight went out of Agnes in an instant. She looked from me to Rosalind, to her weeping husband, to the mountain of a man by the fireplace who had destroyed her. She was utterly, comprehensively defeated. My father, with a final ragged sob, looked up at her. Get out, Agnes, he whispered. Just get out of this house. Get out of our lives. Jedediah Croft had already slipped out of the room, abandoning his co-conspirator to her fate. Agnes stared at us all, her face a ruin of hate and disbelief. Then, with a strangled cry of fury, she turned and fled. The sound of the front door slamming shut was the sound of a prison door swinging open. I stood there in the quiet library, flanked by my sister and protected by the silent man who had given me back my voice. And I wept. Not for what I had lost, but for what, against all odds, I had just found. Myself. After they had all gone, Rosalind, staying long enough to make a tearful, heartfelt apology and a promise to help our father set things right, a promise I believed, a profound quiet settled over the house. The storm had passed, leaving behind a clean, clear stillness. I felt hollowed out, exhausted, but also strangely light. Silas came to me as I stood looking out the library window at the setting sun. He didn't speak, just handed me a glass of water. My hands were still shaking slightly as I took it. Come, he said gently. Walk with me. He led me out of the house and up a winding path to a high ridge that overlooked the entire valley. The evening air was cool and crisp, smelling of pine and damp earth. Below us, the lights of the ranch house began to glow, warm and golden in the twilight. The world seemed vast and peaceful from up here. We stood in silence for a long time, watching the last sliver of sun dip below the western peaks, painting the sky in strokes of violet and rose. "I did not rescue you today, Elara," he said finally, his voice a low murmur on the breeze. I turned to look at him, confused. "It feels very much like you did." "No," he insisted, his dark eyes serious. "I provided the battlefield and the intelligence. You fought the war. That voice, that strength, it was yours all along. I simply gave you a place where it was safe to use it." He was right. He had not been my champion in the way a knight saves a helpless damsel. He had been my ally, my strategist. He had respected me enough to believe I could fight for myself if only the odds were evened. He had not saved me. He had empowered me. The distinction was everything. He took a step closer, his gaze so intent it felt like a physical touch. "When Eleonora died, the light went out of my world. I thought I was content to live in the shadows for the rest of my days. I built walls around myself, and I thought they were impenetrable." He reached out and gently brushed a stray strand of hair from my cheek, his fingers warm against my skin. "Then I saw you. First, all those years ago, a slip of a girl with more courage and wisdom than any man in that town. And then again, bound to that wheel, refusing to break. You were not a light that shattered my walls. You were like a seed that found a crack and began to grow, quietly, persistently, until the stone itself had to make way for new life." My heart felt too large for my chest. The things he was saying, they were the words my soul had been starving to hear its entire life. "I see you, Elara Vance," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he no longer tried to hide. "I see your intelligence, your resilience, your quiet, fierce heart. I have from the very beginning. And I find I am no longer content to live in the shadows." He took both my hands in his. "I am not offering you a sanctuary or a rescue. I am offering you a partnership, a life. I am asking you to build a new world with me, here in this valley. I am asking you to be my wife." Tears welled in my eyes again, but these were not tears of pain or rage. They were tears of profound, overwhelming joy. He was not proposing to the victim he had saved, but to the woman he saw. The whole woman. "Yes," I whispered, the word a breath of pure certainty. "Silas, yes." A slow, true smile spread across his face, the smile I had only glimpsed once before. It transformed him, chasing away the last of the shadows, revealing the handsome, vital man beneath the grief. He lowered his head and his lips met mine. The kiss was not a fiery explosion, but something far deeper. It was the end of a very long winter. It was the quenching of a lifetime of thirst. It was gentle and sure, a promise of quiet mornings and shared silences, of strength and solace. It was the feeling of finally, after a long and brutal journey, coming home. 1 year later, I stood in the greenhouse. It was no longer a ruin, but a vibrant, thriving testament to life. Sunlight streamed through the clean glass panes, illuminating the lush green foliage and the riot of colorful blossoms. The air was warm and fragrant with the scent of damp earth, jasmine, and the deep spicy perfume of the Eleonora rose, which now covered an entire wall in a cascade of blood-red blooms. My apothecary, run from a small, tidy room off the main house, was a success, providing remedies and comfort to the people of the valley who had come to know me not as the town's pity case, but as the knowledgeable wife of Silas Blackwood. A pair of strong arms wrapped around my waist from behind, and a familiar chin rested on my shoulder. "Thinking?" Silas murmured, his breath warm against my ear. "Remembering," I replied, leaning back against the solid warmth of his chest. I turned my head to kiss his cheek, the rough texture of his skin a comforting, beloved thing. Our life together was a quiet one, built not on grand pronouncements but on 1,000 small moments of shared understanding. It was in the way he brought me a cup of tea in the library without my asking, the way I knew exactly how he took his coffee at dawn. It was in the long, comfortable silences as we sat before the fire, and the deep, searching conversations we had under the stars. He had shown me his grief, and I had shown him my scars, and we had found that they did not make us broken, but whole. My father and Rosalind were slowly rebuilding their lives. Rosalind had taken charge, her newfound strength a surprise to everyone, most of all herself. She ensured that my inheritance was fully restored, and we were tentatively, carefully, building a new relationship, one based on honesty and mutual respect. I had forgiven them, not for their sake, but for my own. Agnes had left the territory, her name a bitter memory that no longer had the power to wound me. Silas turned me in his arms to face him, his dark eyes soft with a love that I now saw in them every day. He held up a small hand-carved wooden box. Inside, nestled on a bed of velvet, was a simple silver locket. He opened it. On one side was a tiny, exquisitely pressed flower, the rare herb I had used to save the Albright boy all those years ago. On the other, a new inscription, E. Blackwood. "So you never forget who you are," he said softly. I looked from the locket to the face of my husband, the man who had seen me when I was invisible to the world, and even to myself. He had not given me my worth. He had simply held up a mirror and allowed me to see what was there all along. The girl tied to the wagon wheel was a ghost, a half-remembered dream. In her place stood a woman who was cherished, respected, and profoundly, completely seen. I was home.